immune system experts, right? All right. So now it's my privilege to take you through what is the most exciting subject that everyone loved going through high school, right? History? That didn't sound very enthusiastic. All right, it's kind of a privilege for Dr. Parker and myself to kind of set the stage for you, if you will, on all the stuff that you're going to get from Dr. Vollmer and Dr. Brock. So you got an understanding of the immune system, but you also kind of need an understanding of where transfer factors came from and kind of how they got to where they are today. And so I'm going to give you that information so that by the time you get into Dr. Vollmer and Dr. Brock's talks, you'll have a nice solid base to help you understand and hopefully get more out of what it is they're going to share with you and just how exciting some of the stuff that For Life has done, as well as just how amazing the transfer factors are themselves. So let's kind of go through what we're going to talk about here. So transfer factors are not something that For Life discovered or created. These things have been around since man has been around, and since any kind of complex life existed. They actually, something that was discovered in the 1940s. We'll talk about that whole process here in just a minute. But we have, as you do the math there, that's about 75 years that transfer factors have been known to man, and 75 years worth of research, and that has amassed several thousand publications on transfer factors. Now in the 1980s, we found transfer factors in colostrum. Prior to that, most of the research, and in fact all the research, and all the understanding of transfer factors were those obtained from blood. And we'll talk about the differences between those as we go through this history. And then lastly, near the end of all of this, is the discovery by For Life that transfer factors also exist in chicken egg yolks. So let's go back to the beginning here. We're going to kind of go in a timeline-like fashion, just to kind of follow the history of transfer factors. So again, as I mentioned, this kind of starts in the 1940s. And at this time, a lot of researchers were looking for ways to kind of protect people from infectious diseases that can be transferred from one person to another. And there was one group of researchers that was interested in antibiotics, which we're probably all very familiar with. And so there was a group that was studying down that direction. But there was another group of researchers that were interested in more natural ways of activating the immune system, helping the immune system deal with these potential infections. And one of those was a man by the name of Dr. Sherwood Lawrence. And in 1949, he was the man that came up with the term transfer factor. He was looking at these white blood cells. And Dr. Parker introduced you to the immune cells, and the white blood cells are those immune cells that circulate throughout your bloodstream. So it's all of those cells that we talked about, all kind of gathered together as they circulate through. And so he took these cells, and he said, what happens if we take them from one person and give them to another? Can we transfer immunity that way? And so on his first experiments, that's exactly what he did. He took white blood cells from one person, he injected them into a second person, and he was able to show that the second person then showed signs of immunity. And so he theorized that there must be these factors inside these white blood cells that could transfer immunity. And so he called them transfer factors. And in 1949, that was the first time that term was used. Now he continued his research and tried to further understand what exactly it was in these immune cells that was responsible for transferring that immunity. And so the next set of experiments, he took these cells, he ran them through some freezing and thawing a couple of times, which resulted in basically just breaking open the cells. And then he took what he got out of the cells, so what was inside them, and transferred those to another person and saw the same transfer of immunity. So now he knew it was something inside the immune cells that was responsible for it. A few years later, he took that one step further. Now he took what was inside those cells and he ran them through a series of relatively crude filters, essentially the same things they used in dialysis. And he was able to concentrate the contents of those cells down to these really small compounds that were about 10,000 Daltons in size. Now don't worry about that term Daltons, we'll talk about what that means in a minute. For now, it's just a way to measure really, really small things. And so he isolated these really small compounds and showed that those smaller proteins, these smaller compounds, or what was responsible for that transfer. And so that kind of gets us a lot to where we are today and how we think about transfer factors in terms of size and their function. So we kind of move in now to what we refer to as the middle period of transfer factor research. And a lot of things happened in this time. The researchers were looking for ways to better understand what transfer factors were and to kind of how to describe and characterize these compounds. And there was some kind of debate. Do we look at these and describe them based on their size? Now remember, at this time, they didn't have the technology that we have today. And Dr. Brock and Dr. Vollmer are going to introduce you to some of these technologies that weren't available at this time. And so describing transfer factors by size was not ideal because they didn't really have a precise way to do that. So they thought, well, what about activity? Let's just describe it by what it does. And so there was this group of the researchers that thought, we'll go about it that way. And through this period then, you had them going back and forth. Is it based on size? Is it based on activity? And then what about dose? How much do we give? How do you judge how much is appropriate and make it consistent from one person to the next or one study to the next? And so what they kind of settled on was we'll take 10,000 white blood cells. We'll break them open, we'll filter them out, and whatever comes through the filters there, that's considered one unit. And so that's how they decided to dose transfer factors. We'll give you 10,000 cells as 1 unit of transfer factor. And that's kind of how they standardized the therapy back in these early days. So continuing through this period, there was also some debate as to what transfer factors were. And some of the researchers thought, well, these must be proteins, very small proteins called peptides. Others thought, well, maybe these are nucleotides. So that's a fancy word for basically pieces of your genetics. So are these little bits of DNA or maybe RNA? And others were still like, no, we don't have the technology to really describe it in either of those terms. We're just going to call it by what it does. So still kind of an activity-based description. And then also during this time, there was some still debate as to what size transfer factors were. Some of the researchers felt that it was even smaller compounds down around the 8,000 Dalton size. But there was other groups that thought they might be as large as 12,000 or bigger. So there's still a lot of debate going on as to exactly what transfer factors are. So let's take a little bit of break from the timeline here for a minute and kind of give you some theories on what transfer factors are and how they're made. So what you see up here, the red circle represents an immune cell. And when it comes in contact with something that could be a threat, I remember Dr. Parker talked about the self, not self. So the cells identified this as something that is not self, it's not part of me. It will take it and ingest it and break it apart and kind of examine all the different pieces. And it'll look at those pieces and figure out which are some unique characteristics of this potential threat. And out of those unique characteristics, it will then make a transfer factor for 1, 2, maybe a dozen of these different unique characteristics. You can kind of think of this as like the things you might see on a wanted poster. Right? Is it the hair color? Is it eye color? Maybe it's a tattoo. So these are things that uniquely identify that threat. So this goes into that adaptive immune system that Dr. Parker talked about. We're now looking at specific things. So we're looking for specific characteristics. So it will produce transfer factors, 1 or more of them, for each of these characteristics. It will then put them on its surface, and then as it comes in contact with other immune cells, it will transfer that immune knowledge to those cells. Now, it's also possible, and still yet to be understood, but these things may also be excreted into the blood where they can float freely and come in contact with immune cells that are moving through the body via the bloodstream. So that's 2 potential ways that transfer factors are used by immune cells to transfer immune knowledge. So I mentioned that Dalton term earlier, and this is kind of a good way to help you understand just how small the molecules we're actually talking about. So we start off here on your left with an average-sized woman weighing about 60 kilograms. We go down about 60-fold there to a 1 kilogram melon. Now we're going to go down 1,000 times smaller to a 1 gram paperclip. That's not it. Another 1,000-fold change, we're down to the weight of a snowflake. Has everybody here held a snowflake? I only see a couple hands. Let's put it another way. If you take a single grain of rice, everybody's seen rice? All right. You chop that single grain of rice up into 30 pieces. Each of those pieces is 1 milligram. So we're talking already pretty small. But that's not enough. Let's add 10 more zeros to that. Okay, so for those of you that are keeping score at home, that's 600 quadrillion times smaller than you and me. Who is that? Can we get security? Oh, hey, it's Calvin.
Look, I'm not the smartest, I'm not the sharpest, but 600 quadrillion billion million, what does this mean? In real terms, please, Dr. Vaughn.
All right. Heaven forbid that we should have Calvin confused. Let's put it in other terms. 600 quadrillion. You go outside tonight, find a nice dark place, and you look up into the sky and start counting stars. By the time you've counted all of them in the Milky Way galaxy, you're still going to be short. 600 quadrillion is more stars than there are in our galaxy. So next time you go out and you're looking at the stars, I want you to point up at it and say, that's a transfer factor, that's a transfer factor, that's a transfer factor. Put it... To put it another way, each and every capsule of transfer factor products, regardless of whether it's Trifactor Classic or Plus, contains trillions of individual transfer factor molecules. All right, do we agree that they're pretty small? All right. So also, as we're in this kind of middle period, they start looking at what can you do with transfer factors? How transferable are they? And they discovered that you can take transfer factors from a cow and you can transfer them to a guinea pig, to a mouse, or to a chicken, and they have the same immune effect. This is unique. There's not many things that you can take from one person and give to another and expect it to function the same, let alone from one animal to a different animal and still expect the same effect. So that speaks to just how central transfer factors are to immune system function. They are key. They're something that is common across all mammalian, all complex immune systems. And this also kind of moves us into a transition period here as we move into the late 80s, into the 90s and beyond. As transfer factor research begins to kind of taper off a little bit here, especially in terms of those looking at blood. And we'll talk about some reasons for that in a minute, but the researchers at this time started looking, where else can we get transfer factors? And the thought comes, well, mothers transfer immune information from themselves to their newborn infants. And that must be done through the colostrum. And so researchers began looking at colostrum as a potential source for transfer factors. And in 1989, a group of these researchers did a patent on getting transfer factors from colostrum. A few years later, this was the patent that David Lisaby came across and was what caused him to look at creating 4Life and being able to take the information and all the research that they had amassed at this point and make a company out of it. And so he licensed his patent. And so, as I mentioned, as we get into the 90s, the research on blood-based transfer factors begins to taper off. And the main reason of that is, you may remember in the early to mid-80s, there was a lot of scares that came up about the safety of blood. That was the AIDS epidemic, became widely known. There were issues with hepatitis and some other bloodborne diseases. And so, researchers were less willing to play with blood and to look at it as a source of transfer factors and were more interested in safer forms of it. And so in this time period, these research shifts to looking at transfer factors from colostrum. It's also in this time frame that 4Life discovers transfer factors in egg yolks. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The last thing I kind of want to point out here is this is the first time during this period that we have a researcher looking at what exactly are transfer factors. What is the sequence of amino acids within this molecule? And so one of the researchers makes the first attempt at this and kind of identifies transfer factors as being about 44 amino acids in length, and about a dozen of those amino acids tend to be consistent from one molecule to the next. So about 2/3 of it changes quite a bit, and it provides that specific information, and about 1/3 of the molecule seems to be consistent across all of it. So this is also the time period where, of course, 4Life begins and introduces transfer factor in a commercial option. Up to this point, transfer factors were only available to researchers, and it was an expensive thing to produce and wasn't available to anyone outside of a research institution. With the advent of 4Life, you now have transfer factor in a number of options, and it was the first way that most people had access to these wonderful molecules. And as I mentioned before, at the end of this period, we get into 2003, 4Life furthers the advancements in transfer factor science by finding transfer factors in chicken egg yolks and patenting the extraction of them from chicken egg yolks. All right, so that brings us to kind of summarize everything that we've talked about so far. First of all, transfer factors are not something 4Life discovered. They've been around for a very long time. Dr. Lawrence first identified these things in the blood and found that they were responsible for transferring immunity. Since that time, so from 1940s all the way up to today, you have somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 studies that have been published on transfer factors. That's quite a lot of research for these little compounds. In the 1980s, this research switched from blood-based ones to colostrum-based ones, where 4Life kind of picked that up and carried it forward and brought transfer factor to the masses with the creation of the company there in 1998. And as we continued with that in 2003, 4Life furthered transfer factor science by identifying and concentrating transfer factors in chicken egg yolks. Okay, it's time for another volunteer. Anyone? I'm going to do some new questions. We have a brave soul. Translation? Okay, so our first question. Which blood cells did Dr. Lawrence use to first identify transfer factors? Okay, sailors, sangre. I know a little bit of Spanish, but not enough to be helpful. Okay, from which blood cells did Dr. Lawrence first identify transfer factors?
En las células blancas.
Muy bueno, es correcto. Okay, now let's see if you're paying attention at the very end here. How many studies have been published on transfer factors?
3,000.
3,000? Hey, bueno, correcto. Very good. Give her a round of applause. That was well done. Thank you. Muchas gracias. All right, thanks very much. Now we'll move on to section 3.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the stage Dr. David Vollmer.